The cross and the courtroom, a battle for religious freedom. It was a seemingly ordinary day in Washington, D.C. The sun's late afternoon rays filtered through the glass windows of Karoline Leavitt's apartment, casting a warm glow on her polished surroundings. A young, intelligent woman, she was the White House press secretary, always on call, always ready to represent the president's agenda. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just dealing with a routine crisis or preparing for the next briefing. Today, she would find herself embroiled in a battle much more personal and yet profoundly political. As the youngest press secretary in U.S. history, Karoline had become a well-known figure, adept at managing the complexities of political crises and media relations. A small silver cross hung from her navy blazer, a subtle but constant reminder of her faith. Her style was professional, but the cross was more than just an accessory. It was a symbol of her personal beliefs, something she wore proudly, even as she balanced the weight of her demanding job. But on this particular afternoon, as she answered a phone call from President Trump, everything was about to change. The call wasn't about a national emergency or a diplomatic issue. It was about a local case in D.C., one that carried significant religious implications. The case involved a group of Christians suing because they were banned from praying in a public park, and the president wanted Karoline to observe and report back. This would be no ordinary day. As she sped through the chaotic streets of Washington in her sleek black SUV, her mind raced. She had expected her work to involve policy, press briefings, and high-profile events, not legal battles over religious freedom. But here she was, on her way to the D.C. local court, where the simple act of wearing a cross would set off a firestorm that would ripple through the city, the nation, and even political discourse. Little did she know that this courtroom moment would ignite a much larger conversation on faith, law, and personal freedoms. Upon entering the court, Karoline's presence was immediately noticed. The room buzzed with the energy of ordinary disputes. Parking tickets, minor civil cases, and squabbles over rent. Yet, as Karoline settled into the wooden chair in the middle of the courtroom, she could feel the growing sense of unease around her. The eyes of the room seemed to scrutinize her every move, and her silver cross glimmered under the fluorescent lights, silently signaling the trouble to come. The courtroom's attention quickly shifted to the Judge Charles Hargrove, a seasoned and commanding figure who held the power to decide not only legal cases but also, as Karoline would soon discover, how power was wielded in the courtroom. His icy demeanor was known to strike fear into anyone who appeared before him. Yet, as he glanced around, his eyes fell upon Karoline, and in that moment, the tension in the room escalated. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "What exactly do you think you're doing here, wearing that thing?" He pointed sharply at the cross hanging from her neck. The tone was sharp, dismissive, a clear challenge to Karoline's right to wear the symbol of her faith in the courtroom. The crowd held its breath, and for a brief second, Karoline wondered if she had made a mistake by choosing to wear her cross. But in that instant, she knew what she had to do. She wasn't just representing herself. She wasn't just a political figure on the president's payroll. She was a person with a right to practice her faith freely, and she wasn't about to back down. Her reply was calm, measured, but brimming with quiet authority. "I have every right to wear it, Your Honor. The First Amendment guarantees me the freedom of religion, and that includes wearing a symbol of my faith." Hargrove's response was condescending and swift. "The courtroom is not a place for personal displays of faith. This is a place for law and order. And you, Miss Leavitt, are disrupting that order." The crowd stirred uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, while others whispered under their breath. It was clear that this was no ordinary confrontation. It was a clash of ideals, a moment where personal freedoms were up against a rigid, biased system. As Karoline stood her ground, it became evident that this battle wasn't just about a cross in a courtroom. It was about something much bigger. The right to stand up for what you believe in, even when faced with authority. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. As Hargrove issued a $500 fine for what he deemed contempt of court, Karoline, undeterred and not backing down, decided to fight not only for her own freedom, but for the principle of fairness in the judicial system, the power of law and strategy. As Karoline stood before the judge, receiving the fine, her mind was already working, calculating her next move. This wasn't just about a fine. This wasn't just about one courtroom and one judge's personal bias. This was about setting a precedent not just for herself, but for countless others who might face similar bias in the future. But what Karoline had that the judge didn't anticipate was not just her calm demeanor or the support of millions who shared her views. She had knowledge. She had law on her side. While Hargrove thought he could bully her into submission, Karoline knew exactly how to turn the tables. She didn't raise her voice or become emotional. Instead, she quietly began to dismantle his argument, piece by piece. Are you telling me that my cross disrupts the courtroom when the man next to me is wearing a shirt that says "I am king"? Or the woman across the room is wearing a necklace so large it could be considered a public hazard? She asked, her tone still calm but laced with an undercurrent of frustration. Judge Hargrove, now visibly irritated, tried to brush her off, but the seed of doubt was planted. Karoline knew that as long as she stayed composed, kept her focus on the facts, and didn't let his personal bias sway her, she could not only expose his injustice but take a stand for all those who have faced discrimination for their beliefs. Your Honor, I'm not here to cause trouble, Karoline continued, but I do have the right to challenge your biased actions. You fine me for something that isn't against the law. It's my religious freedom. The room, once filled with murmurs and side glances, fell silent. Karoline had made her case clear, and in doing so, she had also revealed a much larger issue, the personal biases that can be hidden under the guise of legal authority. At that moment, Karoline knew this fight wasn't just for her, but for everyone whose freedoms had been suppressed or overlooked. By fighting for her right to wear a cross, she was standing up for all those who faced similar challenges in society, whether it was about religious symbols, political expression, or simply being treated with fairness. The legal battle turning the tables. The fine had been handed down with swift, almost callous certainty, $500 for contempt of court. For most people, this would have been enough to back down, enough to accept the judgment, swallow their pride, and walk away quietly. But not Karoline Leavitt. Not this time. She wasn't about to let this unjust decision slide. This wasn't just a fight for one person. It was a fight for the many who had been oppressed, silenced, and discriminated against simply for their faith. This was her opportunity to turn the tables, not just in the courtroom, but in the entire system. Karoline wasn't a trained lawyer, but she had something just as valuable: knowledge, determination, and the drive to fight for what was right. She wasn't going to let Judge Hargrove's bias stand unchecked. She had been raised to believe that the law protected everyone equally, that the First Amendment was a shield against discrimination, and that no one, not even a judge, was above it. As the court session dragged on, Karoline's mind raced. She had been in enough press briefings to know how to handle pressure, but this was different. This wasn't just about speaking for the president. It was about speaking up for herself, for her faith, and for the millions who were treated unfairly because of their beliefs. A calculated strategy. Karoline knew that, in order to make an impact, she had to focus on what was truly important. She wasn't about to let Hargrove's emotional outbursts or attempts to bully her distract her from the core issue: discrimination against religious symbols and the First Amendment rights that protected them. She had to remain calm, collected, and in control, no matter how much he tried to provoke her. Her gaze shifted from the judge to the room around her. Hargrove's focus had been entirely on her. A single cross on her blazer, but the room was filled with distractions. There was the man wearing an "I am king" t-shirt, a blatant violation of the dress code, but no one seemed to mind. There was the woman with the oversized, glimmering necklace, clearly more disruptive than a small cross. But again, there was no mention of her attire. The hypocrisy was glaring, and Karoline knew this was her opening. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but firm, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I have a right to wear this cross. The law protects my religious freedom, and I'm doing my job under the First Amendment. I'm not here to disrupt this courtroom. I'm here to observe, as you know. Her words hung in the air, but Judge Hargrove wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on her cross, not the larger issues at hand. He cut her off, continuing his tirade against her attire. His voice was condescending, dismissive, as if he could not fathom how someone would dare challenge his authority in his own courtroom. But Karoline wasn't backing down. Not this time. "I'm here on official business," she continued, her tone unwavering. "And if you have a rule against religious symbols, I would appreciate seeing it in writing. Until then, I will remain here, fulfilling my duties." The long game biding her time. Karoline knew that a direct confrontation with Hargrove wouldn't end well for her in the immediate moment. But she was playing the long game. Her mind wasn't on the fine, or even the immediate consequences of her actions. Instead, she was setting the stage for a much bigger battle. By standing her ground, she was forcing Hargrove to show his hand. The more he reacted to her, the more his bias became visible to everyone around him. She stood tall, her phone in hand, silently recording the exchange. She knew that this moment could be pivotal. What was happening in that courtroom wasn't just about a fine. It was about setting a precedent, about proving that no one was above the law, and that religious freedoms should never be trampled on by those in power. The eyes of the room, though mostly indifferent at first, were starting to shift. They were paying attention. Hargrove, now visibly agitated, tried to move on, to dismiss Karoline as if she were some trivial nuisance. "Step up to the bench," he demanded, his voice growing harsher. The crowd was silent, watching as she walked toward the bench, her heels clicking against the worn wooden floor. All eyes were on her, and for the first time, Karoline felt the weight of the room's gaze. This wasn't just about her now. It was about the fight for religious freedoms, the right to practice one's faith openly and without fear of persecution. As Karoline stood in front of Hargrove, her eyes unwavering, she knew that this wasn't just her moment of resistance. It was her chance to prove that she could stand up to the system, to prove that anyone could. Exposing bias, the turning point. Karoline stood at the defendant's stand, feeling the eyes of the room on her. The tension was palpable, the murmurs in the room growing louder. Hargrove's voice cut through the quiet. "What are you doing here? With that cross? This isn't a church. It's a courtroom." His words were dripping with disdain, clearly targeted at her. But Karoline wasn't flustered. She wasn't about to let him control the narrative any longer. "Sir, I'm here to do my job," Karoline responded, her voice steady and clear. "And I have the right to wear this symbol. It's my religious freedom, protected by the Constitution." The room fell silent. For a moment, everyone seemed to hold their breath. Karoline had just thrown down the gauntlet. She wasn't just accepting his ruling, she was challenging it. Hargrove, clearly unprepared for this kind of resistance, began to falter. His grip on the gavel tightened, his face flushed with frustration. He tried to maintain control, but it was clear the room wasn't on his side anymore. "Do you have a written rule banning religious symbols?" Karoline asked, her eyes locking with his. She wasn't going to let him off the hook this time. Judge Hargrove stammered, his authority slipping. "This is my courtroom. I make the rules. And you've disrespected this court." But Karoline wasn't done yet. "I've broken no rule," she said, her voice ringing out. "But you've broken the law." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The crowd, which had previously been quiet, began to murmur among themselves. Karoline's steady composure, her calm demeanor in the face of injustice, was starting to win them over. She wasn't just a White House press secretary anymore. She was a defender of her rights, of the rights of millions who face bias in the world every day. Turning the tide. As Hargrove tried to push back, Karoline did something that no one had expected. She didn't just fight with words. She had the law on her side. She pulled out her phone, showing everyone that she had been recording the entire conversation. She had the evidence. Evidence that Judge Hargrove was not only misapplying the law but also deliberately targeting her for her faith. "Your Honor," she said, her voice still calm but filled with undeniable power. "I've recorded everything from the moment you called me up to now. I've also texted the White House about this injustice." The room fell silent, and for the first time, Karoline could see Hargrove's facade cracking. He stammered, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The crowd had seen it all, and they were beginning to understand the depth of his bias. The judge who had tried to silence her was now facing the consequences of his own actions. "You're right," Karoline said, stepping closer to the bench. "The law isn't yours alone. The law belongs to all of us. And if you're going to apply it, you have to apply it equally." Hargrove's face went pale. His grip on the gavel faltered. He had just been outmaneuvered by a legal genius in disguise. A young woman who wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in, no matter the consequences. The fallout, exposing the system. What followed was nothing short of a revolution in the courthouse and the larger legal system. Karoline's words didn't just resonate within the courtroom. They reverberated throughout the entire judicial system. What began as a small battle over a religious symbol turned into a national discussion about bias, the rule of law, and the power of social media. The media caught wind of Karoline's actions, and within hours, #CrossInCourt was trending across social platforms. The story exploded. News outlets from all over the country began reporting on how Karoline had challenged Judge Hargrove's authority, exposing his bias for the world to see. Political figures, from conservative pundits to everyday citizens, rallied behind her. The message was clear. Religious freedom was a right that no one, not even a judge, could take away. Karoline's actions didn't just change her life. They changed the course of history. What started as a small act of resistance became a defining moment for religious freedoms in America. And it all began with a single small cross. The repercussions and systemic change. The moment Karoline stood her ground in the courtroom, it became more than just a personal victory. It was the beginning of a larger movement. The courtroom drama quickly spilled out into the streets, into the headlines, and into political discourse. Karoline's battle, fueled by her legal insight and an unyielding commitment to justice, wasn't just a moment of resistance. It was the spark that lit a fire for systemic change. Media frenzy, the power of public opinion. As soon as Karoline's defiance in the courtroom became public knowledge, the media reaction was swift and overwhelming. The story of how a White House press secretary had been fined for wearing a small cross, only to flip the courtroom upside down with her legal knowledge, quickly spread across national news outlets. The #CrossInCourt exploded on social media, capturing the attention of millions. It wasn't just about one woman's fight against an overzealous judge anymore. It was about an entire group of Americans who felt their rights were being infringed upon. Religious minorities, in particular, resonated with Karoline's story. People who had once been silenced by bias and bigotry began to speak up. Karoline had become a symbol of resistance not just for one faith, but for all who sought to practice their beliefs freely, without fear of discrimination. News outlets began to latch onto the story. Fox News, CNN, and even smaller local news stations began running segments about her encounter with Judge Hargrove. The story transcended political lines. Though Karoline was serving under President Trump, her actions were recognized as a stand for basic human rights. She had taken on the establishment, and in doing so, she became an unwitting hero for countless people across the country. One tweet in particular went viral. White House press secretary fined $500 for wearing a cross in court. Fights back with law, leaves the judge speechless. #CrossInCourt. Within hours, thousands of people across the nation shared their own stories. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone take such a bold stand for religious freedom in the public eye, and the ripple effect was felt across the nation. Turning the tables, Judge Hargrove's fall. As the media frenzy surrounding Karoline's victory continued to grow, the fallout for Judge Hargrove was swift and unrelenting. His phone rang off the hook as reporters, former colleagues, and even the Judicial Council began questioning his actions. The once confident judge, who had held absolute power in his courtroom, now found himself the subject of a full-fledged investigation. The Judicial Council had been forced to take action. The public outcry was too strong to ignore. Linda Martinez, a seasoned investigator for the council, had already started collecting evidence on Hargrove's track record. She uncovered disturbing patterns of bias in his rulings, particularly targeting religious symbols. with Christians disproportionately fined for wearing crosses or other symbols of their faith. Karoline's battle in the courtroom had provided the final piece of the puzzle, confirming what many had suspected but were too afraid to speak about. Hargrove's suspension was imminent, and the story wasn't going away anytime soon. People from across the political spectrum began to demand greater transparency within the courts. They wanted to know how widespread this bias was and how many other judges were abusing their power in similar ways. Hargrove, once a pillar of authority in the judicial system, was now fighting to save his career. But it wasn't just about Hargrove anymore, it was about systemic change. Karoline's actions had highlighted a deeper issue that was pervasive in the court system. This wasn't just one biased judge. It was a system that had allowed these kinds of injustices to go unchecked for years. Karoline had put the spotlight on something that many had ignored, and now the system would have to reckon with its flaws. A call to action, legal reforms, and public support. As the investigation into Hargrove continued, Karoline's impact began to expand beyond the courtroom. The White House, seeing the political power of the moment, amplified the narrative. President Trump tweeted his support for Karoline, calling her a legal genius, and praising her for standing up to the biased judicial system. It was a message that resonated deeply with his conservative base, further strengthening the growing movement in favor of religious freedoms. But Karoline's victory wasn't just political. It was legal. As the investigation revealed more about Hargrove's record of discrimination, the D.C. Judicial Council was forced to take action. They implemented new regulations that prohibited bans on religious symbols in the courtroom unless they genuinely disrupted proceedings. Additionally, all court staff, from judges to clerks, were required to undergo mandatory First Amendment training. It was a major win for religious freedom advocates, and it set a precedent for courts nationwide. The reforms in Washington, D.C. were just the beginning. States like Texas, Florida, and Ohio began revisiting their own policies regarding religious symbols in public spaces, citing the #CrossingCourt movement as a catalyst for change. Local communities were inspired to question the fairness and impartiality of their own court systems. People who had once been too afraid to challenge the status quo were now emboldened to speak out, to demand their rights, and to challenge any form of discrimination they encountered. The news of Karoline's fight for religious freedom had also sparked a national conversation about the importance of religious diversity and tolerance in the public sphere. No longer could religious symbols be banned from the public simply because they made people uncomfortable. No longer could the law be manipulated by those in power to serve their own biases. Karoline had demonstrated how powerful it could be to fight back when your rights were being trampled, and how social media and public opinion could be harnessed to drive real, lasting change. The final victory, a new era for religious freedom. By the time the dust settled, Karoline had emerged not just as a legal defender, but as a symbol of resilience and justice. Her quiet resolve, backed by her legal knowledge and unwavering belief in her rights, had turned a small courtroom confrontation into a movement. Judge Hargrove's resignation was the final blow to a system that had allowed personal biases to influence the law. His apology, though met with skepticism by some, was a step in the right direction. It signaled that change was possible, even for those who had once wielded power unjustly. The public reaction was overwhelming. The case sparked a wave of reforms in other states, and Karoline's actions became a rallying cry for those seeking to protect religious freedoms. She had set the stage for a broader discussion about the role of personal bias in the judiciary and the importance of transparency and accountability in the legal system. In the White House, Karoline's role had evolved. She wasn't just a spokesperson. She had become a champion for religious freedom, a defender of constitutional rights, and a symbol of how one person, one belief, could reshape the system. President Trump had praised her efforts, but Karoline knew that this wasn't about her. It was about something much bigger. It was about the power of the people, the strength of the Constitution, and the importance of standing up for what was right. In the months that followed, Karoline's legal expertise continued to grow. She had learned from the experience and had become even more passionate about using her knowledge to fight injustice. Her efforts had inspired a new generation of young people, particularly law students, who saw her as a role model for how to use the law to fight for what was right. Conclusion: the end of the beginning. The story of Karoline Leavitt's confrontation with Judge Hargrove didn't just end with her victory in the courtroom. It marked the beginning of a larger movement. Through her courage, her legal knowledge, and her unwavering belief in the power of the Constitution, Karoline had exposed the flaws in a system that allowed bias to shape decisions. She had shown that one person could make a difference, and that standing up for what was right could create real change. The court's ruling was a victory, but the true impact of Karoline's fight went far beyond that. It sparked a national conversation about religious freedom, judicial bias, and the importance of ensuring that the law applies equally to everyone. Her efforts led to reforms in Washington, D.C. and inspired similar movements across the country. As more and more people began to stand up for their rights, Karoline's legacy continued to grow. For Karoline, it was just the beginning of her journey. She knew that the fight for justice wasn't over, and that she had a responsibility to continue the work she had started. But as she stood before the press, reflecting on what had happened, she understood that her small act of defiance had ignited something much bigger than herself. It had reminded the world that no matter who you are or where you come from, everyone deserves the right to stand up and fight for their freedom. And so, Karoline Leavitt's story became a powerful reminder that even in a world where power often seems to be concentrated in the hands of the few, the law is still a powerful tool for the many, and that justice can still prevail when the people rise up to demand it. If you were inspired by Karoline's incredible stand for justice, don't let this story end here. Like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this. Every like, share, and subscription helps us continue bringing you inspiring content. Together, we can create a community that stands up for what's right. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thanks for being part of the change.